Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that this House should consider the challenges faced by men and boys across our United Kingdom today on International Men's Day. And I'd like to thank the Backbench Business Committee for their consideration, for allocating time today to consider this in the House. On the day itself, the 19th of November, I'd also like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Shipley, for his work in co-sponsoring the debate, as well as those across the House who have supported it. And I've drastically shortened my contribution as our 3 hours have become 1, which is perhaps indicative of a problem of men's issues being pushed off the end of the agenda. Kind of nicely typifies the problem. I want to give as much time to colleagues as I can. But in these challenging times, it's hugely important that we have this conversation. It's difficult because of COVID, and particularly because of the economic impact, when we know there were huge spikes in male suicide and depression following the 2008 economic crash, due to losing employment, struggling to provide for families, struggling to find purpose. It's challenging also because of the general discourse that so often seems to pervade our society that talks of male privilege, of toxic masculinity, and of men as oppressors rather than positive contributors or role models. Men are talked about all too often as a problem that must be rectified. Too often the constant drive for equality and diversity seeks to drag others down rather than lift everyone up. Now, I spoke in Westminster Hall just a few weeks ago about the impact of equalities legislation that sometimes seems like it provides additional help for everyone except men and boys. One of my great passions and the campaign I most regularly return to in this place, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that of working class boys in areas like Mansfield and in other parts of the country where there's deep and entrenched disadvantage. Figures from education show that these lads are least likely of any group to do well at school, to improve their lot in life, to get to university, to ever have the opportunity to spread their wings further afield and aspire beyond the borders of the place they grew up in. Working class white boys often seem to sit bottom of the pile. Across the board in our education system, the advancements of girls has been noticeable. It should be celebrated and recognised that girls are doing much better in recent years. That's brilliant news. It's the result of countless interventions and programmes of support, but it also needs to be recognised that boys very often are not. More often than not, they don't have the same encouragement. No matter what race, geography or social class involved, girls are now outperforming boys throughout the education system. For example, in GCSE attainment, 3/4 pass in 2019 compared to 2/3 of boys. We've had reports of record high gender gaps in university places, with girls a third more likely to access higher education than boys. And it brings me back, Madam Deputy Speaker, to my debate on the Equalities Act, so often misinterpreted and misunderstood. If we know that boys are now hugely underrepresented at university, a growing problem, where are all the programmes to support boys into HE? Personally, I'm not keen on discriminating by gender or by any other physical characteristic, given that it's the law that the Act pushes for positive action based on these characteristics in order to level the playing field. Where is the support for those who are struggling? The figures clearly show that girls are already outperforming boys, so why are we allowing the kind of misuse of our equalities law to exacerbate gender inequality rather than fix it, with countless programmes to support girls into HE and none for boys?
Would my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would he join with me in looking to the very exciting prospect of the holiday and activities food programme to come, and that we must do all within our power to encourage maximum participation from these working class boys, particularly?
I thank you for that intervention. She's absolutely right that constituencies and communities like the one that I represent, with these lads really struggling, and I've talked myself about the need for face-to-face contact and support for the most disadvantaged children. It will be hugely important. I thank her for raising that. On the Equalities Act, I mean, what is the point of this Act if it's used based only on what seems popular or politically correct rather than based on reality in order to help those most in need? The reality tells us, the figures tell us, that it's boys that need the help in terms of higher education more so than girls. So are these interventions actually making this inequality worse? Possibly so. But that's not to say don't help girls, Madam Deputy Speaker. To be absolutely clear, it's not to say that, but simply to say selecting who to help based on physical characteristics alone is, in my view, the very definition of discrimination. The need for this help should be evidenced if it's to comply with the law, and it's to say that boys need help too. They seem consistently left behind by this kind of politically correct agenda. And in my view, as long as the Equalities Act continues to be so willfully and regularly misapplied across gender, race and every other characteristic, it can do more harm than good. We need to make clear in this place that we should be helping people based on their actual needs, that the Act applies equally to everybody. Wouldn't it be nice to try and help those most in need based not on their physical characteristics, but actually on what they need? Or at least to recognise we all have equal protection under this law, whether you're a gay, BME, female or a straight white man, those are all protected characteristics. There are countless challenges facing men in our society. 3 times as many men as women die by suicide, with men aged 40 to 49 actually having the highest rates. Men report lower levels of life satisfaction according to the government's National Wellbeing Survey, but are less likely to access psychological therapies. Nearly 3/4 of adults who go missing are men. 87% of rush sleepers are men. Men are 3 times as likely to become dependent on alcohol or drugs, more likely to be sectioned under the Mental Health Act, more likely to be a victim of violent crime. And of course, men make up the vast majority of the prison population. These figures really put that male privilege in perspective, Madam Deputy Speaker. In recent years, it seemed like there are more and more of those kind of phrases coming in to use designed to undermine the role and confidence of men in our society. I mentioned a few before, things like male privilege, like toxic masculinity. How about mansplaining, manterrupting, the trend of spelling woman with an X to remove the undesirable man part. Wonderfully empowering for some, I'm sure, but as I said back at the beginning of the speech, seeking equality and fairness doesn't need to mean dragging everyone around you down. I'm fairly sure that bad behaviour is not limited solely to the male of the species, nor is rudeness gender specific. The outcome of this discourse and this language for many men is a serious one. I think particularly in the most disadvantaged communities, there's such a thing as a set of working class values, values that have lasted many decades that might be considered old hat or even sexist by the modern establishment. It's a set of values where you hold the door open for a lady, where a man might be expected to stick around and provide for his family, where the role of men as a worker and a breadwinner as a positive role model for his children are still entrenched and well taught. It's not to the detriment of women or to limit their ambition, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's about the promotion of family, of tradition, of strong male role models. These things are important. Having been brought up with those values, you can see why a lot of men from those communities would feel lost if they're unable to find work due to our economic situation, might feel helpless or like failures. They're far from it, but they need our support. You might also find, particularly when considering young men who are looking ahead at their life and seeking their purpose, that they might struggle to find it when they're told that those things they thought were virtues, they're good manners, they're wanting to provide for their family, wanting to be a man's man, wanting to go down to the football at the weekend and have some banter with the lads. These things are in fact not virtuous. They are of course toxic. They're doing down the women around them. Those manners they were taught, the way to respect the women in their life, are now sexist. That banter is now bullying. On family, rather than promoting strong male role models, we often encourage dads to be more like mums. Try to break down that tradition, teach them the opposite of what they've always been told growing up and that they've been doing it wrong. We talk of deadbeat dads. We have a legal system in family courts that seems to assume the guilt of many men in a relationship. We have men being alienated from their kids. We talk more and more about how desirable it is to have different kinds of families. The implication being that we don't need these strong male role models. Is it any wonder so many are struggling to figure out all of this out? It's right that people should live by their own choices and be who they want to be, how they are comfortable, and that is equally true whether you're gay or straight, black or white, male or female. It's equally true if what you want to be is to fulfil that traditional role of a strong father, a provider, a breadwinner. To be fair, for want of a better word, a bloke. I fear that we're building up huge problems for the future when we forget the traditional role of men, and in fact, sometimes not just forget it, but try to eradicate it from our society. With very few of life's advantages on our side in this environment, it's no wonder, Madam Deputy Speaker, when society seems insistent on ripping the heart out of things that they've experienced growing up and things that they've been taught, so many young men tragically cut their lives short. We can't continue to talk down the role and the purpose of young men when we should be building them up. I want to move on from the gloom and doom a little bit and talk about some positive things and some actions that we can take, and I particularly want to pay tribute to dads. I want to say today in this chamber, to all those dads who are putting their families first and doing the right thing, I want to say thank you. I think it's something that's taken for granted, but it's so important, and I know myself how difficult it is in this job to balance being a dad with work and trying to keep yourself on a level and live up to expectations, and it's not easy. I know there are countless thousands of dads out there with a much tougher task than me, dads who might be struggling financially, dads who might be battling things like trying to see their kids, fighting in family courts to do the right thing, trying to be a role models for their kids, when truthfully, we're all making it up as we go along. Dads who might be trying to overcome their own challenges, mental health or work or stress, and might feel like they have to hide that away for the sake of their families and their children. I want to say a big thank you to good dads and to those who are trying their best to be good dads and good men, because I think that can make all the difference for our kids, for families, and for our society. And I want to say that there are places and people you can go to if you need that help. Places like the Samaritans, Rethink, the Calm Helpline, Safe Line, a friend or a relative. It's good to talk, as they say, rather than sweep things under the carpet. So what more can we do in this place? We can change the discourse here, Madam Deputy Speaker, for starters. Can we look again at equalities legislation? If we're to hold departments across Whitehall to account with people dedicated to ensuring that women are considered, quite rightly so, why not the same for men? Why have a minister for women but not one for men? Why single out one characteristic for special mention? Can we ensure that equality means just that, rather than positive discrimination at the expense of certain groups? Male is equally protected as female, and we could do worse in this place to confirm how the Act should be properly used. Can we promote the role of fatherhood and stop shying away from the importance of that role? Yes, families come in all shapes and sizes. I don't wish to detract from anyone who wants to do things differently, but there's a positive role to be played by an active father that cannot and should not be ignored. Modern families are all different, but you can guarantee every single one of them involves or has involved, in one way or another, a dad. And the vast majority of families still look like mum, dad and kids, and that is not and should not be something we shy away from. Can we push forward an action plan to look at male suicide? We know these figures are awful, and have someone in government accountable for delivery of that plan, including better access to mental health support? Can we review our legal system, which is not always balanced, and our family courts, which seem too often to consider dads to be guilty until proven innocent, when it seems like parental alienation is increasing and more dads feel they've been let down by the system? Can we reform the child maintenance service, the bane of every MP's life, by the way, so that it's fairer to all parties and works in the interests of families? Can we have a long-term plan to improve the alcohol and addiction services that are available, the need for which is overwhelmingly male-dominated? Can we boost support for new fathers as well as mothers at a time when men can often feel totally helpless? I'm really pleased that the Prime Minister's race disparity audit, though as the name suggests it focused on race in particular, includes looking at the educational attainment and support for white working class boys. There are regional inequalities there, cultural ones, gender-based ones, but the challenge faced by boys in education can't be denied. The figures show a clear picture of increasing numbers of left-behind boys growing into troubled young men seeking purpose. This is a huge challenge for our wider society, and I hope we can build on this work to look at it in more detail. With that, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll end. I want to give as much time as I can for colleagues, with a thank you to the Minister for her consideration today, and I look forward to listening to the thoughts of colleagues in the Chamber.
Question is as on the order paper, and we'll have to rush into this with a time limit of 3 minutes for backbench speeches, and there won't be much time for frontbench speeches either. Philip Davis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As I've said before, there are many areas where I think men are disproportionately affected and which do not get enough focus in this House, and this debate should be about highlighting those things. I commend my honourable friend, the member for Mansfield, for his speech. Unsurprisingly, I completely agree with him, particularly with regard to the points he made about the disadvantage and poor outcomes, especially in education, of white working class boys, something the politically correct lobby has brushed under the carpet for too long. Just this week, Bradford Council have been consulted on their latest equality plan. They have set targets for people in jobs, including one for 65% of their top 5% of employees to be female. Now, I don't believe in quotas and targets. I believe each job should be awarded on merit and merit alone. But even if you go along with all of this so-called equality, where on earth is the equality in that target? The leader of Bradford Council represents a ward in my constituency, with a high proportion of white working class people in it, and yet she is completely silent in her so-called equality plan about this, despite the fact she must know the disadvantage they face. My honourable friend, the member for Mansfield, has also brilliantly defended good dads, and I want to absolutely echo that message today. I know of men who have had their lives ruined because of a relationship breakdown, which has needlessly led to a whole family breakdown, and in some cases a mental breakdown too. I've talked about parental alienation before and do not apologise for mentioning it again. It is quite simply abuse, and the many people who have written to me with their heartbreaking personal stories show how this happens all too often. It is abuse against the alienated parent, which is not just men, and also against the sons and daughters of the parent too. It also affects a whole host of people in the wider family. I'm pleased that the government have taken some of my points on board with the domestic abuse bill going through Parliament and included parental alienation as an example of abuse in the draft statutory guidance. But I hope the government will continue to look at ways to prevent this, as it would make a huge positive difference to so many if it could be stamped out. Which finally leads me on to suicide. Men's suicide has been a common theme of all the past debates on International Men's Day, and rightly so. As has been said, suicide rates amongst men are 3 times higher than for women in the UK. The connection between relationship breakdown and suicide risk in Western countries has been studied, and I believe that the data from these studies indicates that, unsurprisingly, relationship breakdown elevates suicide risk in both sexes, and more so for men. None of the studies apparently investigated the specific effect on the likelihood of suicide following father separation from their children, despite charities reporting that this is the overwhelming source of that distress. It is quite clear to me that we need to do a lot more to ensure fathers are not stopped from seeing their children to save lives. And in these COVID lockdown times, it's too easy to imagine how this will be causing even more mental health problems and, very unfortunately, more suicides.
Elliot Colwell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And in my short contribution as someone who used to work in the National Health Service, I would like to focus on the health challenges faced by men. And I think I'd like to focus on three primary areas in the short time I have available to me. The first is in relation to the current pandemic and coronavirus, with PHE's review demonstrating that despite making up only 46% of diagnosed cases, 60% of deaths are men and 70% of admissions to intensive care are men. And working age males that are diagnosed with COVID-19 are twice as likely to die. Now, I know that the Minister is continuing cross-departmental work to understand the risk factors associated with this disease, so I would hope that we continue to look into the reasons behind why this disparity exists. The second health risk I'd like to focus on is cancer. In men in the UK, prostate cancer is the most common cancer, and prostate cancer is the second most common cause of death, with around 12,000 deaths of prostate cancer in 2017. In addition, since the early 1990s, testicular cancer incidents have raised by nearly 24% among men in the UK. Now, I know that there has been great strides here. We've seen huge strides in survival rates, particularly among prostate cancer, from 76% of people dying within 10 years in the 70s to just 16% now. But there is still a lot more to do, and I know the NHS long-term plan has an ambitious cancer screening commitment, but this must also be coupled with work done to tackle the stigma around men's health, particularly around male cancers, and too many men leaving it too late before they seek help. But I think, as honourable members have already outlined, one of the most chilling statistics comes in the form of mental health and suicide, because it truly is a terrible thing that the single biggest cause of death in men under 45 in the United Kingdom is men taking their own life. Men account for about 3/4 of suicide deaths registered in England and Wales, and middle-aged men in the UK have the highest average suicide rate of any age group. Now, I again want to draw attention to the good work of the NHS long-term plan, which is working to design a new mental health strategy improvement programme which will focus on suicide prevention. Ministers say that reducing suicides remains an NHS priority, and I would urge them to ensure that that is the case, because it cannot be right for the most common cause of death for anyone of any age, gender, sexuality, race, religion or creed comes from them taking their own life. So I would urge the government to do all it can to make sure that these terrible health statistics are consigned to the dustbin of history as soon as possible.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow my honourable friend from Coshot and Wallington in a very informative speech, and he's touched on many of the points that I also wish to raise. But in beginning my comments, can I also commend my honourable friend from Mansfield for highlighting these issues. He's been an ardent campaigner on this since he was elected to this House and beforehand, and these are issues that we just have to talk about. And I want to focus my comments today on three areas in particular, which is firstly domestic abuse, secondly mental health, and thirdly the attainment gap that my honourable friend from Mansfield articulated so well in terms of the points there. Can I first of all pay tribute actually to my honourable friend from Louth and Horncastle, the Minister of Justice, for piloting through the domestic abuse bill, which is currently awaiting its second reading in the other place. This bill will ensure that all victims have the confidence to report their experience of domestic abuse. But when we look at domestic abuse around male victims, we see that 786,000 men have reported being victims of domestic abuse. And when we look at actually the numbers of men that are prepared to report domestic abuse, in comparison to 88% for women, only just over half of men will report domestic abuse at any one time. And in terms of refuges and safe houses, currently there are 37 organisations with 204 spaces. Of those 204 spaces available, only 40 of them are dedicated for men. And in Greater London, there are no spaces for men needing refuge from domestic abuse. The Respect Men's advice line has said that some male victims of domestic abuse have reported sleeping in cars or in tents or in the gardens of their relatives to avoid, to seek refuge from their abusers. The fact is, Madam Deputy Speaker, as someone that has seen domestic abuse firsthand, the ability to escape that is absolutely fundamental to ensure people survive. And we need to be doing more to ensure that there is provision there, because there clearly is a gap of provision, even though I pay tribute absolutely to those organisations who are supporting those victims and those survivors, shall we say, of domestic abuse. In terms of mental health issues, my honourable friend from Carshalton and Wallington articulated it absolutely perfectly in that 75% of men, so suicide deaths in England and Wales are men. We need to tackle that, but we need to tackle that across the board as well. It's not right. We need to be looking at those fundamental underlying issues that lead to these deaths. And I don't want to repeat the stats that my honourable friend read out, but I do just want to round off my comments by saying this. You know, ultimately, this is about ensuring that all of us have the access to those services, that support that we need. We should value everyone as that individual, as that core person, as to who they are, irrespective of gender, irrespective of what they look like, irrespective of where they come from. And I think that what this debate highlights today, Madam Deputy Speaker, and what my honourable friend from Mansfield has done, has drawn that out once again. And I pay tribute to him, and I pay tribute to the fantastic work that's been done to support men in the areas I've highlighted today. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Tom Hunt.
Deputy Speaker, I'd first like to thank my honourable friend from Mansfield for securing this vital debate. And I do agree with his comments about the underperformance of boys from white boys from underprivileged backgrounds in the school system. The facts are there for themselves. They can't be disputed, and I think it's right that the Education Committee that I sit on is currently looking at this issue in depth. And that isn't to say we're not going to look at other issues, but why shouldn't we look at this one issue as well as other issues as well? I want to talk about men's mental health, which I think is getting more attention now than it ever has done. But the simple fact is that many men who struggle with their mental health don't feel comfortable talking about it, whether they think deep down it's a sign of weakness. Of course they're wrong, it's not. They should feel comfortable to talk about it. And I think to myself, but I think that awareness of mental health now is greater than it's ever been, and the reason for that is because there isn't a single person in this country whose mental health hasn't been impacted to some extent. And I think even about my father, if I'd spoken to him a year or two ago about mental health, he probably would have said sort of, man up, stiff upper lip, kind of very masculine approach to it. Whereas, 75 years old, somebody had to shield himself. I remember talking to him about this very issue not long ago, and I never thought I'd hear it. My dad himself was talking about his mental health, and actually I think that's a good thing, and I think we should encourage more of that. So there are great challenges, and the pandemic has, brought this to light more than ever. Many of the things that men rely upon, going to watch a football, fishing, golf, these sorts of things haven't been possible, particularly during the second lockdown. I'd like to highlight something brilliant, though, which is happening within Ipswich, which is in Chantry, and the local landlady, Penny, spoke to me over the summer about the problem of men's mental health and how she wanted to do something about it. Within a very small period of time, 2 to 3 months, she now has 33 members of her men's mental health support group in Chantry, Rex Manning from the local area, professional trained chef. And what they've done is they've actually secured an allotment, a Robin Drive allotment. They all go down there. All of the men go down and become members, talk. So actually, even if I don't feel comfortable talking about their mental health directly, by engaging in something which is so good for our well-being like that, it really brings people together and the whole community together. And also the produce they make for vegetables, Rex then collects it all together and they all eat it together in the local pub. So this is a very challenging issue. It's right that we have this debate. But on the topic of men's mental health, I do think there's a great opportunity here. I think the pandemic's highlighted mental health more than ever before. But talking about your mental health is not a sign of weakness. It's something that should be encouraged. And I think it's right that we have this debate here today. And I commend my honourable friend for Mansfield for securing it. Thank you very much.
An honourable gentleman has unusually withdrawn from the debate, which gives us a tiny bit of extra time. I'm therefore going to raise the backbench limit to 4 minutes. Alexander Stafford.
Deputy Speaker, for good news. I commend my honourable friend, the member of Mansfield, for securing this very important debate. We both understand the acute disadvantages and difficulties experienced by men in our region of the UK, ranging from health and education to incarceration and suicide. I welcome the opportunity to draw the House's attention to this unacceptable inequality and stand up for men and boys in my constituency. We do not talk about men's mental health enough, and toxic masculinity is a severe problem. Tragically, suicide remains the biggest killer for men under the age of 45. Research also suggests that men who are less well off and living in most deprived areas are up to 10 times more likely to die by suicide than more well off men from affluent areas. a grim statistic that's relevant to areas of high deprivation such as mine in Rother Valley, the likes of Maltby and in Dinnington. This must be addressed. But beyond the realms of health, many men suffer from low attainment and reduced opportunities at every stage of life. This is of particular concern to me in Rother Valley. At school, it is an old adage that girls consistently outperform boys at GCSE level, and they have done so for the past 30 years. At higher education level, over 67,000 fewer men than women accept places at university, a huge gap of 35%. After 10 years of government reforms, standards are indeed increasing. However, for areas like mine in Rother Valley, this cannot come soon enough, and we must continue to put pressure on schools, universities and companies to do more for working class boys and men. And I read only this week that SOAS in 2017 did not accept any white working class boys into their university, and that is a disgrace. Now, it's also working that women in Rother Valley are in full support of empowering our local men. They see the everyday struggles of their fathers, brothers, sons, uncles, grandfathers and friends. They do not have the reductive mindset pushed by many liberal metropolitan elite of the Labour Party, where men as a whole species are blamed for gender inequality. Instead, they recognise that women still face substantial social inequality, and they absolutely do so. But so do many of our men. For example, 79,000 people are in prison, 96% of whom are male, a shocking statistic. These men cannot be blamed for having privilege they simply do not possess. I'm in full agreement with my honourable friend, the member for Mansfield, on this point. I want to lift everyone up, men and women, rather than dragging them down. This, of course, fits with the persistent campaign for Rother Valley to be levelled up across the board, in all areas, in all sectors, but especially for all people. Growing up in Maltby or Dinnington should not mean that you have a lesser chance of succeeding professionally, and it should not mean that you lack access to high-quality services and facilities. Unfortunately, too many men and boys in Rother Valley tell me exactly this. They feel abandoned, left behind, and forgotten. It is in everybody's interest that we raise our men's aspirations and help them use their inherent talents to reach their full potential. I firmly believe that this government is doing so for men, boys, and everyone, but especially for those in Rother Valley.
Madam Deputy Speaker, International Men's Day has been an annual event since 2010. The UK has the most events of its kind anywhere in the world, and it's overseen by the Men and Boys Coalition. It's a registered charity of over 100 organisations, academics and professionals who believe in a society which values the well-being of men and boys. Some very positive themes. It makes a positive difference to well-being. It raises awareness and funds for charities supporting men and boys. And it promotes a positive conversation about men, manhood and masculinity, all of which is a very good thing. But there are some serious themes too. In 1998, my very closest friend sadly committed suicide. It was a devastating event for me and his family and all of his friends. And I'm very well versed by the mess that's left behind. So we must end the stigma of men's mental health. And we need to commend the truth that it's okay not to feel okay. So please seek help is the simple answer. But it's also about the challenges faced by men and boys at all stages of education. It's about shorter life expectancy, it's about infertility, workplace death. It's about challenges faced by the most marginalised men in society, homeless, boys in care. It's about inner cities, black and white, working class males. Male victims of violence. It's about the challenges faced by men as parents, and about survivors of sexual abuse, rape and domestic abuse. It's all relevant. And in this era of identity politics, it's becoming increasingly popular to ridicule men who display traits of traditional masculinity, of self-reliance, of personal responsibility, of discipline and of courage, even fatherhood. Well, guess what? I don't subscribe to that, because all men matter. Indeed, the UK prides itself on being amongst the top meritocracies in the world. Equality of opportunity is something that we absolutely must strive for. So it's about black and white, gay and straight, male and female. Everyone has a role, and no one must feel ashamed of who they are. So this is not about men as a comparative species. It's simply about drawing attention to particular issues affecting men. Lastly, some quick stats, if I may. In 2018, almost 5,000 men took their own lives at a rate of 13 per day. That's a rate of 17.2 per 100,000. This is the highest rate since 2000.